I'm assuming there was a pistol on the back of her head when she said that, because it looked like a hostage video. I mean, are we really at a point where you can't even write a book that is in Russia without it being a problem?
Every conspiracy theory about Ukraine starts somewhere. This one starts with, Eat, Pray, Love? Well, not really, but we'll get there. I'm Yulia, an independent political journalist, content creator, and most important of all, a concerned Ukrainian citizen. You're listening to FAQ-U by Svidomi Media, your friendly neighborhood fact check for Russia's special disinformation operation. Today we'll break down what the war in Ukraine has to do with Elizabeth Gilbert's best-selling novel, if anything, why the world is outraged, and where Russian propaganda fits into all of this. Why don't we hear from Ms. Gilbert herself?
Over the course of this weekend, I have received an enormous, massive outpouring of reactions and responses from my Ukrainian readers, expressing anger, sorrow, disappointment, and pain about the fact that I would choose to release a book into the world right now, any book, no matter what the subject of it is, that is set in Russia. And I want to say that I have heard these messages and read these messages, and I respect them. And as a result, I'm making a course correction, and I'm removing the book from its publication schedule. It is not the time for this book to be published. And I do not want to add any harm to a group of people who have already experienced and who are all continuing to experience grievous and extreme harm.
You know what? Fact this nonsense. Elizabeth Gilbert is completely on point. Let's sort it out. On June 12th, Elizabeth Gilbert posted what should have been a non-controversial video on social media, announcing that she was delaying the release of her newest book, The Snow Forest, explaining that her reason for doing so was the sincere outreach by Ukrainian literary fans who were concerned about the Russia-centric themes of the book at a time when Russia is engaging in such overt imperialism worldwide. To her credit, Gilbert's response was not to question the motives or authenticity of Ukrainian voices, but rather to stand in solidarity with them as an ally. For literally no good reason, the internet blew up, with many critics declaring it was so-called cancel culture, censorship, and out-of-pocket attention-seeking behavior from Ukrainians. The reality of the matter is that the book takes place in Soviet Siberia, and the concern is that when people would go looking for further information about the setting, would they find a plethora of well-rounded, well-informed sources? Obviously no. They would find propaganda, towing the official Soviet and now Russian-approved line. In addition, the central premise of the book revolves around a family painted to be rebels against the regime and outwardly anti-Soviet eco-activists, while the real-life inspiration to the story simply ran away from religious persecution and met their end from hunger and kidney failure. Were the forests of Siberia empty? No. They were populated by Ukrainians and other non-Russians in gulags. Unfortunately, considering the striking absence of historically accurate literature and contemporary accounts, it could easily be assumed by the casual reader that Siberia was not, in fact, a fascist hellscape. Gilbert appears in her book to acknowledge that Soviet Siberia wasn't ideal, but without the inclusion of the realities and the scope of Soviet atrocities in the remote region, it comes across as romanticizing. Joining us today is Maria Shuvalova, a literary scholar from Kyiv Mohyla Academy. She specializes in the global influence of propaganda in literature and will be providing us with critical insights into why the aggressive response to the Ukrainian outcry is both unfounded and harmful.
Hi guys, my name is Maria Shuvalova and I'm a Fulbright scholar. I did my research on Fulbright here in Harriman Institute, Columbia University in 2019-2020.
Maria, let's set this straight right off the gate. User at Joyce Carol Oates seems to think that, quote, of course they don't read, in reference to Ukrainians. When you have a concerted political agenda, as in Elizabeth Gilbert's case, there is no literary aspect to the issue at all, just sheer politics, end quote. What do you have to say to that?
Oh, we also don't speak English, obviously. Each time Ukrainians are giving interviews, they are facing reaction. Oh my gosh, you speak another language. Like, yeah, if you belong to colonized culture, you might be treated as a wild, not educated person, but actually, oh my gosh, publishing in Ukraine appeared earlier than in Russia, as Ukrainian language appeared earlier than Russian language, and Ukrainian reading culture is impressive. I highly recommend to read you an article published by The Guardian, how book readings was flourishing during blackouts. And during this crisis caused by the war, because each sphere of human life is just dramatically changing, the bookshops are flourishing in Ukraine. People are establishing independent bookstores and keep producing books even in Kharkiv, and they look gorgeous. Because making a good book and reading a good book, it's a resistance and also a way to deal with the stress these days. Because when you're interrupted in the middle of the night by air raid, you have to go to the bomb shelter. It's not a nice place to work or to sleep. So what do you have to do? Of course, read. So actually, thanks for Russian aggression, we started reading even more, I might admit. Kyiv Mohyla Academy was a huge center of publishing, but it was even earlier, like Ivan Fedorov and the invention of printing machine, and also Ukrainian translation of Bible was recognized as the most masterful comparing to all other translations of the Bible. So we have a lot of achievements in publishing, in the book industry, and in reading as well.
Let's move on to my favorite narrative, censorship. User at David Cleon claims, quote, censoring literature set in Russia is stupid and illiberal, and it should be emphasized, does Ukraine's righteous cause in this war absolutely no favors. So let's talk a little about how Russia doesn't censor literature, shall we?
Because one famous author, she hasn't given me a permission to mention her name during that, I will just refer her an author, refused to publish the translation of her book in Russia because it was not possible for a publishing house to use word Ukraine. They always demanded to use it the Ukraine, na Ukrainian, not in Ukraine, and a lot of different small things that distort the meaning. And of course, people are not willing to do that. And we had few examples when chapter or a part of the book was completely changed and meaning was changed, because that's the Russian propaganda. They demand this change to be made. So we have to be very careful, and authors are facing this as well. And it's a nice way for us to start a conversation about sharp power. So we definitely have heard about soft power, but have you ever heard about the concept of sharp power?
Can you tell us a little more about that?
The National Endowment for Democracy popularized the term sharp power. It appeared in an article in Foreign Affairs magazine describing aggressive and subversive policies employed by authoritarian governments as a projection of state power in democratic countries' policies. And this article is specifically named the Russian state-funded RT news network as example of sharp power, but books and novels, they can also be sharp power. It can also be a tool that not necessarily seeking to win hearts and minds, but also they are surely seeking to manipulate their target audience by distorting the information that reach them.
Well, here is an interesting one. User at Katya Sedgwick says on Twitter, quote, if you are consuming Russian literature uncritically, you're probably wasting your time. Russian literature is great and thought-provoking, and no, you're not supporting any kind of imperialism by reading, end quote. Can we unpack this one?
I was talking with a colleague of mine who did a degree in Russian studies, and after full-scale invasion, she took a course in Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and she was very frustrated. She said, like, I was fooled. In my university, I was always told that Russian literature and culture is great because these people suffered so much. And then I took this course. I heard about Taras Shevchenko. I realized that he didn't have the ability to write in his own language. He didn't have a publisher. He didn't get money for printing his works. He was imprisoned. He was illegally arrested. And nevertheless, he became worldwide famous. And like, yeah, this guy suffered. Oh my gosh, how could I be blind about the scale of all of that? And indeed, Ukrainian authors were not able to reach publishers, especially foreign publishers. And even right now, the international publishing sphere is a bit closed because you need to have direct contacts with agents. But not all Ukrainian authors are having that even right now. So it's still pretty close sphere. So that's why broader audience, mass audience, are not able to read Ukrainian literature.
I think this tweet is very fitting to continue our conversation. User at Amy Alcon says, quote, "Mobs against speech chill speech. This is sick. It's her decision," referring to Elizabeth Gilbert, "but her book isn't some smear of Ukrainians. It's set in Russia. Should I burn War and Peace and Crime and Punishment? Two simply great novels. Or is that utter f***ing idiocy?" End quote. And that brings us to what's wrong with the great Russian novels.
War and Peace, Dostoevsky didn't depict how Polish were rebelling and protesting against Bolsheviks, but it's a thing which happened. And he generally depicted that there is Russia and like nothing else except that. It often ignores a lot of minorities, a lot of different independent countries. And if you want to be a bit critical about things like that, note and read Russian classic literature with decolonial perspective, I highly recommend a book by Eva Thompson, Imperial Knowledge. And it's just fascinating how you will see that there is a Russian army officer who is very poor, and he is going to army to earn a bit of money, and he go to the war, and it's just small detail. You don't, the author is not elaborating on that, and 200 pages later you'll see that he came back from the war. He bring chairs, some furniture, clothes. And oh my gosh, it just few mentions, and it's depicted like not something strange, like not a crime, but just ordinary details, and probably it won't attract your attention. But now, or if you're reading the book from the decolonial perspective, you will see that the guy go invade and steal someone's stuff and get it back to home. Like right now, like Russian soldiers are coming here, stealing stuff and earning money here.
So we've covered the greats, but user at Bifakadu WG says this, quote, "Friday poem, UN Russian Language Day coincides with the birthday of Alexander Pushkin on June 6th, a Russian poet considered the father of modern literature." End quote. So let's talk about what modern Russian literature is really like.
Russian invasion of Ukraine started in 2014. First books in Ukrainian language about this current war were published in 2015. And by 2019, they exceeded 600. And many of these books are translated, they got awards. So lucky for me, I really had huge amount of books to have this inner discussion, inner dialogue of all genres by all different people, because Since 2015, we had poetry, novels, essays, nonfiction, comics, graphic novels dedicated to current war, and they were written by soldiers, professional writers, military chaplains, volunteers, journalists, civilian journalists, and military journalists, internally displaced people, military family members of deceased soldiers, Ukrainians, and also foreigners. I always have this desire to compare how were depicted in Ukrainian and Russian literature. I started looking for novels or essays, maybe graphic novels about this war, but written in Russian language by Russian authors. And I must admit, prominent Russian writers do not write about the war, and Russian belly dancers and conductors, as Ukrainian belly dancers and conductors, they do join volunteering battalions, and best Russian poets do not die in trenches. So, nevertheless, I found few novels written by Russian authors about current Russian-Ukrainian war. They have several features, but one is the most prominent. Part of them were written before the invasion of Ukraine since 2009. For example, in 2009, a fantasy novel, genre defined by the author and the publisher, which is called The Battlefield is Sevastopol by George Savitsky, was published. In 2011, the book won Lyudmila Kozinets Prize, and this prize is named after a Russian writer and member of Literary Association of Crimean branch of the Union of Writers of USSR. It still exists. And it's an award for best work in science fiction, fantasy, literary mysticism about history, culture, current situation, and future of Crimea. I translated an annotation for you because 0 books that was published by Russian authors about this war was translated into English. First of all, because the quality is poor, it's very offensive and very chauvinistic. So 2009, Battlefield is Sevastopol. Near future. The Russophobic policy of Ukrainians' orange authorities provoke a new Crimean war. American and Turkish peacekeepers occupy rebellious Sevastopol, breaking all international agreements. The nuclear aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan and the battleship Iowa enter the Black Sea. What can destroy this monstrous gun and powerful armor? Only Russian submarine. American armor boils. The aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan is boarded. Landing ship of the Black Sea Fleet under the cover of the guard cruiser Moskva. It's very fun because the Moskva is on the bottom of the Black Sea now. Black Sea Fleet rushed to help the insurgent Sevastopol. So now you can see that Americans in near future launched the war in Ukraine and Russia is going to save the world. In 2009, George Savitsky published one more so-called fantasy, and it's titled The Battlefield is Ukraine, Broken Trident.
I'm starting to see a pattern here.
His biography is not available on the internet. I also could not find where he was born, when, and was not able to find any video or interview with him, only one photo and only one note that he is from Donbass. Very often, if you are reading how Russian media are presenting this author, you can see how hardly people are working to give some credibility to these authors. Often they claim they are scholars, they're experts, they're policy analysts, or they're Ukrainians. So they, by themselves, witnessed everything and described that in their literature. But actually, I'm not sure that George Savitsky is the actual person, because this guy wrote more than 47 books, and they are huge. So maybe it's just a farm that are producing content like that. And I also translated a description of this book provided by publishers. So Battlefield is Ukraine, broken trident. The year 2010, having provoked riots, the Orange Nazis unleashed a civil war in Ukraine. With the help of peacekeeping continent, and peacekeeping continent is in parentheses, of NATO, and under the cover of American aviation and armored vehicles, Western Ukrainian punishers with a trident on their shoulders start exterminating the Russian-speaking populations, erasing entire cities from the face of the earth. Poltava perishes in a fire, and Dnipropetrovsk is destroyed. Towns on the left bank of Dnipro, Crimea and Novorossiya, are against invaders. Russia is helping the resistance fighters with the latest weapons, volunteers, and military advisor. They will break the f***ing Bandera trident. Oh, very pathetic. But you immediately can feel that it's so similar to the previous book.
What a fortune teller this author is. Any other interesting works of great modern Russian literature?
In 2009, one more novel was published, War 2011 Against NATO by Fyodor Berezin. And in 2010, Berezin's book won an award at the Start Bridge. It's a festival of war fantasy that was held in Kharkiv from 1991 to 2014. And I prepare another translation for you guys. So, near future, betrayed by its own elite, Ukraine is occupied by American troops. NATO warplanes are loitering in the sky. The Romanians occupied Snake Island, and the Turks landed in Crimea. The democratic is in parentheses, the democratic West diligently ignores the aggression. Kyiv is silent, and the Ukrainian army does not resist the invaders. But there are still people loyal to military duty and officer honors. And here author means Russian-backed separatists and Russian combatants. NATO hawks are on fire, shot down by rebellious missile division. A fighter aviation regiment refuses to obey the order of Kyiv capitulators, and the urban partisans arrange hell on earth for the invaders, so for Americans. These books are not only for Russians, because when we will look of the interview by Jack Heath and Fyodor Berezin, it was published in The New Yorker, and part of this sharp power with all of this literature is also for Western audience. And as few my colleagues shared with me who are Western scholars, there is such presupposition that if the writer is Russian writer, he has to be great. On January 2016, The New Yorker published an interview with Fyodor Berezin. And the interviewer was Jack Heath, who apparently knows Russian, since works of Berezin have never been translated into other languages, as other books I mentioned. Interview begins with the mention of Berezin's current occupation. Jack Heath introduced Berezin in the following way. One of those local fighters, Fyodor Berezin, became a deputy defense minister of what the rebels call the Donetsk People's Republic, and now trains new recruits in tank artillery. Berezin is an unlikely leader in any war. Before all this took place, he was a sci-fi novelist in a genre of historical fantasy. Interestingly, that during the interview, Jack Heath 3 times highlights that Berezin radically changed his occupation, a writer who became a fighter. And yet, Berezin is a professional combatant. And actually is on sanction list in European Union and elsewhere. But I think that the main difference is that for Russian authors, this war is imagined. Therefore, they keep choosing fantasy as the genre, while Ukrainian authors write about real one. Therefore, a large number of Ukrainian books are documentary literature, but not exclusively. Literally, all genres are represented, and the authors are having very different occupation. The second key difference is time perspective. While Russian contemporary military fiction depicts a near future, a time perspective that allow prophesizing and this messianism. Ukrainian literature about the war depict recent past, time perspectives that allow retrospection, analysis, relevation of traumatic experience and trauma. And the third key difference, Ukrainian literature about the war is a response, while Russian contemporary military fiction is a predecessor. First go novels, then go tanks.
And that'll be it from our guest today. If you'd like to read quality materials about Ukraine, Maria has compiled a whole list of books for you to check out, linked in the description below. Join me on the next episode as we continue to bring facts to the battlefield of Russia's special disinformation operation. And in the meanwhile, if you'd like to be filled in daily on everything that happens in Ukraine, as well as hear some sassy responses to Russian trolls, don't forget to follow me on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at YEWLEEA, and extend that same courtesy to Svidomi Media, also linked in the description of the podcast. Well, ta-ta for now, and FAQU, Russia, and your special disinformation operation.